the best thing is to do something about it quickly and not get into a planning exercise. So you want to write a blog, you're motivated today. The worst thing you can do is to get into extensive planning. The best thing to do is to just write something.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sanjay Khandelwal and this is The Break School, a self-learning podcast to enable you to do what you love every day. Today we'll be looking at a very interesting problem. Just ask yourself these few questions. Do you often sign up for online courses but never really start learning? Do you often decide to eat healthy food, go to the gym when you're sick, but you get back to your old ways as soon as you recover? Do you aspire to find better career opportunities, do well in your life, but you do nothing more than consuming a few inspirational videos here and there? Now, if you had asked me these questions, my answer would be absolutely yes. I often do all of this. In fact, all of us do that. It's a problem called the intent-action gap. A problem where there's a huge gap between what we intend to do and what we actually do. And on the show today, I have a very special guest to help us understand the reasons for this problem and how can we overcome this. I have with me Anurag Vaish, co-founder of India's leading behavioral science firm, Finalmile Consulting. At Finalmile, Anurag has led multiple projects across various domains such as financial services, healthcare, education, with the goal of designing behavioral systems to ensure compliance and commitment adherence. On this episode, we'll learn from Anurag 3 major reasons for intent-action gap, 2, how do we strengthen our commitments, and finally, the power and limitations of inspiration in driving action. If you've been consuming inspiration all the time, you should definitely listen to this. If you love this episode today, don't forget to subscribe to the Break School podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast listening apps so you don't miss any of our future episodes. If you'd like to listen to any specific question, you can find the list of all the questions in the show notes section of this episode. Okay, that's enough of me talking. Now enjoy the conversation. Presenting Anurag Vaish. Hi Anurag, welcome to the Break School. How are you feeling?
I'm good, Sanjay. Thanks for having me here.
Thanks for coming down, Anurag. Anurag, you started one of India's leading behavioral science firm a decade ago, Finalmile Consulting. I would like to understand from you, what is behavioral science, if you were to explain to a layman, and how did you get interested in behavioral sciences?
Yeah, sure. As reflective self, you want to believe that there were a confluence of many important things for you to have started something like this. But factually, it's just a happy accident, right? So whenever somebody introduces you to behavioral sciences, and that's not just for me, what I've seen with other people also that I've met over the 12 years is that once you fall into it, there's really little way to get out of it, right? It's
Okay.
it's it's too interesting. The conversations are really useful. It gives you a deeper sense of what you are and probably gives you justifications for everything that you do wrong, so you don't feel so bad about yourself anymore. So those are all the good reasons why you get stuck to it. In my case, I think Biju, one of our partners, had been playing with behavioral sciences for a while, and so when he spoke to us, it was natural, saying, this is what we need to really change how we approach behavior change projects. Even though all the 4 of us did not have any really academic background in behavioral sciences, but that's what behavioral science is. It's so intuitive. You can see it all around you. You don't need to really go and find them in books.
Okay.
But also, I think most often we do get carried away with what we see in popular literature around behavioral sciences, right? And start to believe that behavioral sciences is a set of principles. It's behavioral economics, it's heuristics, it's biases.
Correct.
But as you kind of get deeper into it, you realize that behavioral science is a lot more, right? It's about design, it's about evolutionary psychology, it's about our cognitive faculties like attention, memory, emotions, and so on and so forth. So what got us into it was obviously predictably rational and nudge and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But what keeps us there today is way beyond that, if that makes sense, Sanjay.
It makes complete sense. In fact, I just want to pick two things from what you said. One is behavioral science tends to justify everything that you do wrong and makes you feel a little less guilty. And secondly, the popular literature, right? Because just to mention some of the popular books, Thinking Fast and Slow and Nudge and all of them, I'm sure a lot of people are reading the books. I myself, I'm a big fan of Thinking Fast and Slow. But I just want to understand from you, do you think reading these books may make someone aware of issues and why they behave the way they behave and would put all the blame on the biases that we've developed over thousands of years? But does it really help anyone change their behaviors?
Not to say that it doesn't help anyone, but very few of us are really highly motivated people who plan our lives and stick to that. So it's difficult to imagine how any significant portion of our population across the world
Hmm.
would be able to self cure themselves from biases simply by learning from it. Right. So simply
Right.
because I know about my bias, I can cure myself of it is to my mind a massive hyperbole.
Mm.
So when we are in a hot state of decision making, when there is what Simon Herbert called bounded rationality, which is when we don't have enough time, when we don't have enough resources, when we don't have enough energy, right? When
Hmm.
we don't have all the information that we need, that's when biases really kind of play a role. And they seem like negative. They're not negative. Biases, heuristics are also our way of making decisions in situations where any other alternative form of decision making is too costly,
Right.
right? And that's why I am personally a strong believer in design. To my mind,
Hmm.
is the role of design to influence human behavior and not necessarily intent, motivation, awareness. Right? Those are highly overrated, as it's easier to plan yourself, but when you're experiencing that plan, you could still behave in ways which are deviant from what one would say is the ideal path to behave. And that's where the intent action gap comes in many ways, right? Saying, I intend to do this, but my actions are not aligned to my intent.
Right.
Right? That's primarily because the intent is a plan and action is an experience, right? And the planning self and the experiencing self are massively different most of the times. And that's where the environmental factors, the design that you have created in that environment to change your behavior is far more potent than your own awareness, motivation, intent on that particular aspect of behavior.
But this is a very interesting aspect, Anurag, the intent action gap that you just mentioned, right? That today I decide that for the next 30 days I'm going to go to the gym, right? Or today I decide that in the next 2 months I will learn how to blog. But then when it actually comes to doing it or doing it consistently, my actions are completely different from what I had intended to do, at least. From your experience of working with people and developing designs, which we'll get into, what do you think are the fundamental reasons there is this gap? Are there some common reasons that most of us exhibit, most of us as human beings exhibit?
Yes, of course. I mean, that is what the science has brought to the table, right? And I think there's a fundamental flaw when you believe that you have decided to do something. You have not decided to do something. You just plan to do something.
Okay.
So you kind of looked at information around you and said, "This is what I should be doing."
Mm-hmm.
That's a plan, right? That's an intent, which is mostly a weak desire. It's not like a strong need. When we get into strong needs, right, to eat and to have sex and so on and so forth, that's very different. Here we are talking about intent, which is saying I've reassessed my environment and I feel I should do certain things, right? Which is at best a willingness and not necessarily I will. It's a weak desire and not a strong need.
Right.
See, it's not even instinctual in nature that this is how I'm designed to kind of behave. For instance, when we get our medical prescription and you have some kind of an infection or some kind of illness, and a doctor gives you certain medicines to consume over a period of time,
Mm-hmm.
there is no gap at the time of receiving the prescription, right? You are completely aligned. You think this is good for you. Your current physical state is crying and shouting at you to kind of just go consume these medicines and get better.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point in time, you're like totally aligned with what has been offered to you. But over the course of the next few days, you start to feel better. your context has changed from the context you were in earlier.
Correct.
The earlier context was illness and being in distress. That context has now changed to you're feeling good, you're feeling better, you feel healthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and these two contexts will create a different decision context, a different decision paradigm, right? You'll appraise your same situation differently. You'll appraise the same expected action of consuming medicine as per the plan differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what kind of leads to gaps, right? We've seen this in the work we did for tuberculosis in India, and one of the big problems is how non-adherence is the reason why people migrate from rather benign traits of TB to far more harsher ones. And it's not unusual because when you were diagnosed with TB, you're in a very pathetic self,
Correct.
and you kind of stick to the plan. But quickly over the next 3-4 weeks, your situation changes dramatically, and then you are assessing everything from a healthy point of view rather than an unhealthy point of view, and all the motivations, all the reasons for consuming medicine declines dramatically, right?
Correct.
And so you need a different design at that point in time. The same design that worked on day one is not relevant anymore.
Right. Right.
So what I'm saying is that one is how context changes is very important. Our decision making is very highly dependent on the context in which we are making the decision.
Right.
The second factor would be probably how strongly we were committed to those actions from the very beginning. So if it was a weak desire, weak commitment, the chances that you would fall out of it is also very, very high, right?
Correct.
And that's what happens, for example, in self-learning, right? You start exploring some application, some other source of education, very, very weak intent, very, very weak desires, no strong commitment to kind of follow through with it.
Right.
And you kind of get out of it, right? Because there was no strong commitment, there was nothing that was bounding you
Mm-hmm.
to those actions, so you get out of it, right?
Right.
Um, Third, I've seen many, many companies kind of create this as one of their first principles of behavior change, which is how easy it is to do what you want to do, right? So sometimes it's just not easy enough to do what you want to do.
Right. There are a lot of barriers.
There are a lot of barriers. It's just cognitively as well as from an effort point of view, it is taxing. And in such situations, you can expect people to fall out of their intended actions pretty quickly.
Right. Right.
Again, we know things which are not easy but are fun, right?
Hmm.
So a lack of fun, a lack of feedback, a lack of reward, again, can kind of get you out of intended actions, right? So if you look at it, right, there are many, many things and that gets us out of our intended actions many, many times because there are just so many factors.
Right. That's interesting, Anurag. So the three reasons that you mentioned, and I would like to go in detail on all the three reasons. First is the complete change of context, right? Wherein the context in which you made the decision, and the context in which you need to act on the decision are different. Second is the weak commitment issue, wherein you've made a commitment, but that's not strong enough for you to act on it, right? And third is there being multiple layers of barriers, be it cognitive or physical effort required in order to achieve what you've intended to achieve. Now, going to the first one, you said about the context. Now, a few weeks back, I had spoken to a colleague of yours who told me about something called recreating the decision making context, wherein you've made a decision in a certain context, and in a way, you design a system such that uh, you can recreate that context. I just want to understand from your experience, particularly with the working with TB patients that you just mentioned, was this possible? And second, how did you deal with this specific issue in which the context of the patient had completely changed, and you had to design something so that you made sure that they adhere to the decision of taking medicines?
Hmm. Yeah, so this whole idea of recreating the context is slightly false in the sense that if the context has changed, then people are experiencing it, right?
Right.
If I'm not as pathetic anymore with my health situation,
Mm-hmm.
it's really difficult to kind of say that no, 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 you should feel like that.
Hmm.
But if you go back to the TV case, one of the things we did was about changing people's goals. So basically saying that there are disease goals that doctors and experts have. which is to get the disease out of your body.
Correct.
But as human beings, we have life goals. As you kind of go through the TV cycle of cure, your ability to do life things
Mm-hmm.
changes from week to week.
Right.
So, from not being able to even eat properly to being able to eat now, to not being able to socialize to being able to socialize.
Hmm.
So, if you map cure over life goals, it becomes far more relevant. It's far more goal aligned to human beings. And
Correct.
there, the chance of adherence improves, right?
Right, right. So you're saying connecting it to a much higher goal helps better than just connecting to immediate goals?
I mean, higher assumes a difference of importance, but I would say relevant. So the higher goal with kids is for them to learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
A more relevant goal is to have fun, for instance, right? So substituting fun or kind of infusing fun into learning,
Right.
one wouldn't say it's a higher goal, but it's a far more relevant for the user. So yes, and there's a reason why we have so much fun in learning now than we used to have in the past, right?
Right. So I'm just trying to think out loud. Let's say I have a person with me who wants to become a food blogger, loves blogging about food, and is currently working in an IT company. Now, he's been waiting for a long time to learn blogging. Now, in this case, one is his goal could be that I need to learn blogging, which is basically something that you just need to learn. But second is I need to learn blogging so that I could have more control over my time. I could master something that I love and do more of it or write more about it. And perhaps that goal, which is much more relevant, which is where I want to get into through blogging, could help me push myself better than just thinking about blogging.
It does, I mean, all of these evolution of commitment or evolution of intent from being, wanting to be a blogger to being an ace blogger obviously requires you to take many different steps from time to time
Correct.
and make yourself something that really the world appreciate. And what you're really anticipating is a lot of hurdles, a lot of barriers, a lot of feedback from time to time, which motivates you to get out of it rather than stay in it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in such situations, how do you persist with what you started? And
Correct.
highly motivated people, which to my mind is less than 0.1% of the world population, would find a way. But we should be talking more about those 99.9% people who are more likely to get out than stay in. And that's where I think all the environmental design factors come into play. Because ultimately, this blogger is not going to create his own platform to blog. He's going to use an existing platform to blog, right?
Correct.
To my mind, a lot of the onus rests on the platform to keep the guy in it.
Right.
There are many, many things one can do on the platform to keep people on the platform. So, for instance, how do we constantly evolve goals and not assume that the goal that you started with is the goal that you have as you're moving through it?
Correct.
So, when I start running a marathon, my goal could be let me try, let me see how far I can go. And so, there you want to use that goal of people to motivate them to start the run.
Correct.
But once you are, say, 10 kilometers into it, that goal is gone. That goal has been fulfilled. So, what is the new goal now? You need to get this guy on for him to go the next 5 miles, next 7 miles, next 10 miles.
Hmm.
So, how you evolve people's goals, how you provide them a new sense of relevance in that journey is an important part of getting them stuck on the journey rather than getting out of it.
Interesting.
The other that I've seen as very, very potent is just investment, saying, what is the investment I'm making on that platform or on in that action which keeps me on it?
Okay.
Basically, saying that there's a sense of ownership. There's something here that belongs to me. And, one of the things we've done with self learning, for instance, is this ability to take notes in an app.
Okay.
And if it exists only in that app platform, what you've done really is kind of created a sense of ownership. This highlights, these notes are something that belong to you. It doesn't belong to the platform.
Correct.
That's your investment. And sometimes these small investments, these small customizations, these small archivals that you have created for yourselves can be very, very potent reason to keep sticking with it, right? Because they grow. They have such sense of ownership that you don't want to give it away. We know how ownership works as a bias. Simply because you hold something in your hand, you start feeling ownership. This is what stores do to you, the sari shops and all. They let you touch, feel. They need literally make you feel as if you already own something that you have not bought, right?
Ah,
And then you're kind of trapped in it. It just feels more valuable, right? And so there are many things that platforms can design or actions can design in such a way that you kind of put yourself into a commitment trap,
correct.
rather than expecting yourself to stay as motivated as you were in the beginning.
Right, right. Fair enough. And I want to take a leaf out of your answer here about evolving goals and reinforcements you just mentioned some time back. So, one of the things that I've experienced with myself is I have a huge threshold to change, right? Or to just start anything. Let's say I've started podcasting, and initially there's this huge threshold wherein I need to put in the effort to create a podcast episode. But once I've created it and I see that people are listening to it, that becomes a great reinforcement cycle, the results of your own work. Now, I'm not sure if this is just consistent with me or this is in general true for people, wherein when they see the results of their work, they're more self motivated to go ahead and do more of it. uh, and secondly, with respect to evolving goals, I think that's very true, and that's something interesting how we could, as individuals, people who want to, let's say, transition out and do something on our own, do to keep pushing ourselves forward. Let's say if I've learned, I'll just start with something smaller, and as I see the result of that work, keep going forward and then evolve my goal to do something bigger. That could be an interesting idea.
No, I think absolutely right. So where there is positive feedback and the feedback is more immediate in nature, those
Mm-hmm.
situations are really self-fueling themselves into the next level of commitment and engagement, right? So
Correct.
but the fact of the matter is that not every situation kind of provides for such immediate positive feedbacks, right?
Right.
You could have negative feedback. So you kind of started a blog or a podcast and you're not getting enough listeners. That's negative loop.
Correct.
So where there are positive outcomes and positive feedbacks and loops available, those are not necessarily situations that behavioral sciences really need to have a point of view on, because those are just naturally good situations to be in.
Correct.
But imagine situations where the feedback is not available. Learning, for instance, you could go several weeks and have no feedback on how you've evolved as a learner. Um, but imagine running, imagine getting yourself up in the morning and going for a run.
Hmm.
How many cycles of that behavior do you need to really do to really start seeing a difference in your body?
Right.
And that's where you look for the peripheral, right? So rather than looking at health outcomes because you ran for 2 mornings, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to create some other source of inspiration. So running with friends, for instance, has a peripheral value which is outside of health. Reason you started running was not because you wanted to chat with friends.
Correct.
But if chatting with friends becomes a motivation for you to continue to run for a few days more before those evidences become evident to you, that's fantastic.
Right.
So the ecosystem design in many ways fuels you rather than the core motivation or the core goal that you had to begin with.
Correct.
If you get to meet interesting people in your podcast, that's a goal by itself,
Absolutely.
and that's a feedback by itself, irrespective of how many listeners you got in your first podcast, which are unlikely to be very high because that's how the nature of evolution of things are.
Absolutely, absolutely. And do you think the number of steps that a FitPass tells you, or the number of calories that you've burned, that let's say an app tells you, sort of is designed not actually to push you forward, but create a feedback loop which tells you, okay, you're doing good, and maybe you need to do more of it.
I would presume that's the case. It creates some kind of anchor, it creates some kind of an artificial goal to achieve.
Correct.
Uh, and so there is some tangibility to it rather than just walking, just running. On my own personal account, measures are something that we like to track, right? So the moment we have a measure, we want to look at it, right?
Correct.
Much like exams, I want to see the numbers, right, that I got in my exam, irrespective of the feeling of learning I have or not.
Yes.
So I'm sure that measures by themselves are motivating, or forget about motivating because they could be bad.
Correct.
So measures by themselves are indicators. They have a potent role to play in designing your behaviors. We
Right.
just need to make sure that when it's positive, leave it alone. When it's negative, we need to find a way of managing those metrics because they can equally have a strong detrimental effect, right? So, for instance, one of my grievances with self-learning is assessment by itself.
Okay.
You get into a self-learning program And within the first few sessions, you test people, right? And I often think that many times this is the assessment that gets people out of it,
Okay.
because you get a feedback saying, oh, you're not good enough. For you, it's a small amount of effort because you think, oh, the guy just did 1 hour of learning English. How much could he have learned,
Mm-hmm.
right? But from the guy's perspective, it's an infinite change from where he was, where
Correct.
he never studied English, to having spent 1 hour kind of reading through some words. And now
Hmm.
he gets a feedback saying, oh, you're not good enough. And the guy says, okay, I'm not going to get good at this. So let me get out. This is where behavioral science again kind of has amazing applications on how we present these numbers, how do we frame these numbers, how do we create anchor points from time to time in ways that it kind of feeds the upward loop rather than the downward spiral.
Right. So this is something that I would love to discuss, the designing of systems to help avoid certain biases or inclinations without we realizing it. Once we're done with discussing about our remaining two reasons. So just going to the second reason for the intent action gap, which is weaker commitments. Now, to begin with, what would you count as a commitment? Is it just a stronger form of intention, or is there something more to it?
So there is no vocabulary gap over there. It's not a scientific term. But commitment is investing yourself into an action to an extent that the actions are evident. You really want to do something now.
Mm-hmm.
And my learning on commitment has been that one of the things that we can do to ourselves is always believe that our commitments are weak,
Okay.
irrespective that sometimes it may be really strong. And a commitment to live a more disciplined life, a commitment to reading more often, a commitment to learning more often, whatever, right? At the very beginning of that journey, it always seems like, oh wow, I'm gonna be in it forever,
Correct.
and that's delusional mostly.
Yes.
And so, if people can train themselves to believe that their commitment is a weak one, that's a great starting point to my mind, right?
Right.
Um, and then, you need to now say that if I know my commitment is weak,
Mm-hmm.
or if you know that the system is currently only activating weak commitment, a weak desire, a weak intent, an action that's not going to last for very long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you can start designing systems and self in a way that you strengthen your commitment over time, right?
Okay.
So, for instance, to make a big commitment upfront is a bad idea, right?
Okay.
To say that every day I'm going to walk for 2 hours, I'm going to work out for several hours, right? Delusional, not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You're better off saying, like, let me start with a smaller commitment. So, let me go running for 15 minutes every day. And then, as I start to feel the pleasures of it, as I start to enjoy the morning environment, the people around me, and so on and so forth, I'll escalate to 30 and 40 and so on and so forth.
Right.
That's a good way to kind of manage your commitment. We also know that personal commitments are pretty weak.
Okay.
The commitments we make to ourselves are weak. They don't tend to last for too long, right?
Mm-hmm.
So inviting other peoples into your commitment is a good way of making those commitments strong. So sharing a commitment with other people, right? Letting larger groups of people know that you have committed yourself to doing certain things tends to have a much more lasting effect.
Okay.
And that's simply because of how we value our self image. So I don't want to be seen as weak in front of others, irrespective that I'm happy to live with my own weakness, with my own self.
Correct.
Writing down your commitments always helps because verbal commitments are weaker than written commitments for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Is the reason why we write documents and contracts and so on and so forth. So, one example, we are doing work for a big bank in India to see how we can get people to pay their dues on time, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a massive amount of effort to get these people to pay up. On an average, it could take like 20-25 calls before a person really pays his dues. And one of the realization there was that any promise to pay that a person makes is typically a very weak commitment.
Okay.
So call center agents can delude themselves by believing that, oh, the person said he's going to pay on so and so date, and I take his word for what it is. But then when the day comes and the time comes, the person doesn't pay up. And that's simply because a verbal commitment that the person made does not necessarily have any strong elements of commitment in it. It's just a way of getting out of that situation, right?
Correct. Correct.
So what we said was that let's assume that this is a weak commitment, and that's why it fails so often, right?
Okay.
Now, can we use some of our behavioral science knowledge to really see how we can strengthen that commitment in that moment itself? So, one of the things we did was we converted the verbal commitment into a written commitment, right? So rather than people saying, I'm going to pay, and you say, oh, thank you so much for agreeing to pay, one of the things you do is send him a text message, right? Saying, Mr. So and so, thank you for committing to pay this amount on such and such date. We really appreciate your commitment. We look forward to getting this money from you, right?
Okay.
What you've really done is converted a verbal commitment into a written commitment. And we know from evolution, from scientific understanding of decision making, that written commitments are much stronger than verbal commitments. Now, if you are not sure that this is good enough, you can add more layers of commitment in it. So, for instance, two-party commitments are weaker than three-party commitments.
Correct.
So what we said was that the agent would tell the customer that thank you for making this commitment. I'm going to let my supervisor know that Mr. So and so has made a commitment to pay so and so amount on so and so date.
Okay.
Right? Even if you don't tell the supervisor, from the user's point of view, it's no more a two-party commitment; it's a social commitment with three parties, right? And so it kind of further strengthens the way the commitment was made,
Mhm.
rather than what the commitment was, right? Which is the whole commitment tool, saying it's not just important what the commitment is, it's also how the
Commitment
commitment was
made.
made, right?
Yes.
And so by kind of layering these commitment tools into that initial week commitment, really strengthened the commitment dramatically. And the results were dramatic. I mean, the bank had never seen such sharp spikes in collections from their efforts. And this is not magic. This is just how human beings are wired, right?
Right.
It's scientific in nature, right?
Perfect. In fact, the idea about telling my supervisor that you would be paying or making any kind of social commitment, do you think joining certain communities, for example, let's say going back to our food blogger example, this guy wants to learn blogging, this guy wants to write well, etc., and he joins a food blogging community online, on Facebook, on anywhere on the internet, if not offline. By doing that, his tendency to actually work, by seeing others around him work and nobody actually asking him to do anything or he making any kind of explicit commitment as such there, but just by observing a lot of people around him doing things and achieving results, that could push him also or strengthen his commitment of becoming a food blogger.
I think personally, I think it's an engagement tool, right? Saying rather than being a loner in this whole pursuit, you become part of a community where many people are doing the same things. You realize that there are no immediate winners in anything.
Right.
So everybody who is part of that commitment or community are experiencing similar things. So you're not the only person who is getting negative feedback for that matter, right?
Correct.
You start enjoying a lot more because you start sharing experiences. So that's also one impact of social, the way it works on you, right? It kind of makes decision making easy. It creates social proof of what people are doing. So it kind of guides your behaviors in times of uncertainty.
Correct.
You can be guided by other people's behaviors, right?
Right.
So those are all very, very positive. But then there are negative aspects of it. So you join a community and you see a winner in that community, and you start feeling that you're not good enough to be like him. So you want to
Aha.
get out, right?
Yes.
So in a classroom, it's very easy to spot the first rankers, second rankers. They don't motivate you; they demotivate you.
Right. I
These are
agree.
the front benchers. You're never going to be like them. So the back benchers keep drifting backward and backward. The front benchers keep winning again and again and again.
Hmm.
So that kind of a community doesn't help people who didn't really start on a strong footing.
Right. I used to be the front bencher until I was in school, and then I moved to the last bench in college. I don't know how.
That's because you felt that you have already achieved
Yeah.
all your goals in
No,
life.
no, because in my school I was the front bencher, right? But as soon as I moved to college, there were smart people from across the country. And then I was not the smartest one, and I didn't want to be somewhere in the middle, so I moved to the last.
Yeah, that's how context change helps actually. So now reverse the situation, right? Say you were the backbencher in a school.
Hmm.
You have kind of created a social platform where there are automatic hierarchies being established, right?
Mhm.
That these are winners, these are losers. So for 10, 12 years, you'll broadly remain, notified as backbenchers and front benchers, and so on and so forth, right?
Correct.
Sometimes by just changing that environment, getting into a new school, you could get a new start because in an existing context, it's so difficult to really see yourself differently from how it is.
Right.
But equally, classes can be designed in such a way that people move around; they don't sit on one. particular bench all the time,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is front bench and back bench and so on and so forth. So to my mind, environments can be designed for the social proof and the community system to work
Right.
rather than assuming that they work by themselves.
Right. Perfect. Perfect. So just to summarize our discussion on commitments, one of the things that strengthens commitment, as you said, is beginning with the one is, of course, you start with the assumption that your commitment is weak. And at least my personal experience and experiences of people around me who I often talk to, commitments are generally very weak until unless they're driven by some extreme situation in life. So one way to strengthen them is to start with smaller commitments and then gradually go upward so that you don't feel that huge resistance to move forward.
Correct.
Second is making social commitment is much more stronger than making individual isolated commitments that only you know of.
Mhm.
And perhaps the idea of maintaining or sustaining your self image pushes you to do well there. And thirdly, the writing commitments, right? Written commitments are much more stronger than verbal commitments. And this is something I've seen with myself that I very often, when I'm overwhelmed or very often when I know I need to get done something, I write it down in a notebook. But there is one small discrepancy that I observe in my experience, which is, let's say I want to do 3 4 things over next 1 month, and I will write it down in a book. The challenge I feel, and I don't know if this is a false analysis that I'm making, which is I'm not analyzing it rightly, but sometimes I feel just by the act of writing, in my head, I start thinking that I've already done it or I've already gotten started on it. I never come back and look at that piece of writing ever, or I don't think I use it as a piece of feedback. But it often happens with me that just writing makes me feel good that okay, I've gotten started with it.
Yeah. I think you're mistaking two things. You're mistaking stress for commitment, right? This is stress.
Okay.
So basically, that as a human being, we have something called working memory in our brain, which is a really small space, something that can't hold even 5 digits and 7 digit numbers in it.
Correct.
It gets overwhelmed very quickly. So when you have 3 4 thoughts in your mind, right, 3 4 things to do, the working memory is getting clogged. And what it's doing is stressing the whole cognitive system because the new thoughts that needs to come into your working memory for doing everyday work is not getting that space. So the brain is saying that, what, this is important to you, but you're not doing anything about it. And I want you to take care of it, right?
Hmm.
The act of writing is telling your brain that I've taken care of something that's important.
Okay.
I've taken care of it in a way that I'll not forget. And so what it does, it relieves the stress. It relieves the stress completely because what you wanted, what your brain was struggling to keep it in its working memory,
Hmm.
is now transported to literally a hard disk, which is your written paper, right?
Correct.
And so your working memory can be now free to do something else. That's just the stress management way, right? And in fact, I tell people who suffer from stress that, and workplace stress, especially when you have so many things that are worrying you. So, for instance, if you're worried about what's going to happen with your appraisals in the next 1 month, and there's really no way to figure that out. So you can continue to be stressed with it. One of the ways to deal with it is to write it down somewhere
Okay.
because the brain suddenly feels that you've taken care of it.
Right.
It's tricking your brain into believing that something got solved when it really never got solved, right? But it's much better than kind of living with that stress forever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So we'll just move on to the last aspect of the intent action gap that we discussed, which is removing barriers. The fact that there are a lot of barriers to achieve the intended purpose. Now, there are two ways to, of course, push anyone to achieve an action. One is to push them to use nudges or to use a force. Second is to remove barriers that are preventing them from reaching there. Now, in what kind of situations does the second one really work? Or is there any understanding that we have saying nudges work in a certain context, but removing barriers is what is more important in certain specific contexts?
I mean, it's very difficult to say in this context versus that context, right? But
Okay.
every context presents its own challenges. When we're doing work on HIV, for instance, in Africa, where there's massive intent for people to get themselves circumcised to prevent, this infection from spreading, right?
Mm-hmm.
Massive intent. Everybody knows about it. Full awareness, 100% awareness, 70% men wanting to get circumcised, so on and so forth. But the outcomes are only about 11%. Very, very few people really kind of go and get themselves circumcised actually.
Correct.
So the part of it is motivation, saying how do I nudge people into going and getting themselves registered? How do I build a better belief system in this process, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But if you study that context accurately, you will see the real barrier is in a very different stage of the journey, where people are unable to accurately anticipate the amount of pain and discomfort this causes during the healing period.
Okay.
So if you want to remove that barrier, you need to bring more vividity to that process rather than ignoring it.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes just making it real is good enough, rather than people using hearsay to understand that it's really simple or it's really difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
So creating some accurate benchmarks on what that pain is like, how long that pain is going to last,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of discomforts people might have. That's also removing a barrier by just bringing it to the front.
Right. Makes sense. And with respect to identifying barriers, any kind of barrier that exists in decision making, can you just walk me through the process of how do you identify barriers? Maybe we can go back to the road mapping example if that's what it is, and if a live example of how you had studied a certain process to understand what goes into identifying barriers.
It's fairly complex in the sense that understanding the decision framework, and we use something called emotional appraisal as our key framework, which says all decisions are driven by emotions. If you don't have emotions, you can't make any decisions.
Right.
So this whole idea that your decision is emotional in nature is a falsehood.
Okay.
I mean, all decisions are emotions. And so the critical job is to understand how emotions are coming into play in any decision making context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once you know how the emotions are coming into play, you understand what's propelling and what's preventing the decision from being made, right?
Okay.
And because emotions are themselves so complex, right? Because it's a mix of physiological, psychological, motivational factors coming together in a spur of a second to create an emotion that then guides your action, right?
Mm-hmm.
The study of it is also complicated. So you need to look at, for instance, how pleasant, unpleasant a situation is. You need to understand what goals and beliefs people have. You need to understand how those goals and beliefs are aligned to what you are trying to achieve in that situation. You need to understand your own ability to cope with outcomes. So there are many factors, which is part of the emotional appraisal framework, that allows you to assess a situation and figure out what emotion it might create, and from that emotion what actions one might see or get exhibited.
Right.
And so we use those frameworks to really figure out what is and what is not helping the decision making process. And then you can work with either of the factors. You can either reinforce what is helping, or you eliminate what is not helping, or you correct what is not helping, and therefore you have a new way of making decision in that context, right?
Right, right. So I'm just going to simplify this a little bit here. I'll just give you a specific situation, just a curious thought on how you would look at it. Let's say I go back to my food blogger example, and this person has worked in an IT company for 6 years. Uh, Loves food, is staying in a different city. He's from Kanpur, but he lives in Mumbai, and has been blogging for a little while, going around exploring food, and just writing about them. And he's been trying to identify how could he do this full time, right? Now, what questions would you ask him? Any two or three fundamental questions to understand why would he not make this transition?
You're trying to get me to solve a problem impromptu. The point is that you're trying to understand what decisions he makes. So
Right.
if his emotion in that situation is one which is negative in nature, it's got a negative balance to it, which is he's not happy about it, or is he not getting enough reward out of it, then you're trying to understand what is it that's creating this reward sense. So if, for instance, he's coming from the sense that, you know what, I see so many people who don't achieve anything out of it.
Hmm.
And so at the beginning, you thought, I'm an outlier and I have this overconfidence and optimism that I will achieve, which is what entrepreneurs do most of the time. Once you're into it, you're getting too much social proof around how most people are not successful at it.
Correct.
And that's guiding your decision making now, right? So if, for instance, I figured out that it's the social proof of failure that is prompting his decision to reassess his path, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you will start to kind of work on those factors. So you would either create a new norm and create more vividness about those who succeed, right?
Correct.
Or create a roadmap for what makes successful people succeed in these situations, or bring a new goal, right? Saying that, okay, forget success as a goal, let's rebuild the kind of goals that you can have with these kind of activities, and so on and so forth, right? But the whole idea is to get him to tell enough stories to you of that context so you can read how his emotions are getting formed.
Okay.
So it's never really a Q&A. It's never really saying, okay, so tell me why this and why that, right? Most often people don't know the whys.
Correct.
And so the better thing to do is to glean more stories, listen to more stories of their experiences, to really make sense of those stories and understand what are the factors contributing to the current emotion, and therefore what can you expect as its actions, right? And then go back and say, how can I influence these stories?
Right.
What is it that I can design so that the formation of the emotion is different, right? And therefore the actions coming out of it.
Right. Right. Perfect. Now, speaking of influencing those stories and designing something for them, there is this huge billions-dollar industry of inspirational and motivational books and speakers, right? That at least claim to push you forward and do well. I'm just curious from your experience, how effective are they in the long term?
Because so many exist, one has to assume that there is importance, because otherwise they would have naturally got eliminated from the system.
Right.
So I think they do their task, which is get people start thinking about certain things. But to believe that inspiration leads to actions, that's a minority behavior.
Okay.
And I'm personally not interested in anything that's minority behavior. If certain things could get 1% of people to change their behaviors, that's not something that interests me.
Okay.
We need to look at people like ourselves, like people like you and me, who are generally responding to situations of uncertainty and risk in a way that is not necessarily very useful to us, right?
Yeah.
And we need to kind of shape their behaviors, right? Their environments for better decision making, right?
Correct.
And in those kind of situations, I think inspirational, motivational stuff don't have the durability to change people's behavior.
Correct.
I've been to many, many such programs. Some of the best in the world I've been to. In the moment, they look very powerful, very inspirational. They seem like life changing.
Mm-hmm.
But once you're back to our work environments, once you're back on the road, most of these things do not shape our behaviors in any durable way, so to say.
Right. In fact, what you say, the minority behavior, or how only 1% of people would actually go ahead and do it or have a lot of self motivation. One thing that boils it down for me there, and it's a little scary assumption that in my head is: are we humans by nature lazy? Is self motivation really a rare asset or a rare trait or available in rare quantity with all of us?
So, two parts. I think physically we may not be as lazy as we are lazy from our brain's perspective. Our brains are really lazy.
Okay.
And that's for a good reason, because it's one of the most inefficient system that you can come across in the world.
Okay.
For the mass it has, it consumes too much energy. The stat is that it's a 7% mass consuming about 23% of your energy, right?
Okay.
So brain is constantly looking at shortcuts to make decisions, because it's extremely taxing to spend all of your energy in making decisions, right?
Right.
So there's no doubt about the fact that brains are lazy.
Correct.
Uh, Self motivation, on the other hand, to my mind, is not something that's in short supply, right?
Mhm.
What I challenge is its durability.
Okay.
It's not that people can't motivate themselves into doing something. I mean, that beginning of intent, the beginning of action, the fact that people start to do something
Mhm.
many times comes from motivation. My problem is the sustenance of it, right? I think the sustained motivation in long term is a very, very difficult task that only a very, very few people can achieve on their own, right?
Okay.
And so when you see motivation, you need to really bring all your design tools to the table and say, I've got this guy who is motivated. Now it's my job to kind of keep him motivated and not assume that his motivation will on its own last forever.
Right. Somewhere on Twitter, I'd read that inspiration is a very perishable, or inspiration or motivation is a very perishable commodity. Act on it before it lapses.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the commitment tool. So saying the moment you acted on it, you've gotten into a commitment trap in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So say I'm motivated to be altruistic in nature. Now you can keep planning forever on how this altruism will play out, how you'll be generous and so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the first thing to do is to do something.
Right.
The moment you do something, you've gotten into a roadmap, you've gotten into an act which will reinforce itself.
Correct.
So you're right, because it is so perishable, the best thing to do about it is to do something about it quickly and not get into a planning exercise.
Correct.
So you want to write a blog, you're motivated today. The worst thing you can do is to get into extensive planning.
Aha.
The best thing to do is to just write something.
Correct. Correct. Act on it. Yes. Thanks a lot, Anurag. Thanks a lot. It was a wonderful conversation.
It was really good talking to you. I mean, it's a pleasure. I'm so self-obsessed with behavioral sciences. I can go on and on, but it's good to think about them from time to time. Um,
And Anurag, if anyone from the listeners, if they want to reach out to you or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
I am on Twitter quite a bit, and I'm on Anurag Vaish. It's a simple Twitter handle.
Thank you so much, Anurag. It was great having you here on the show.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you so much. Good fun talking.
So that was Anurag Vaish. My 3 big takeaways from this conversation were: start with small commitments. Let's say you want to go on a run every day. As Anurag mentioned, don't start by thinking about running for an hour every day. If you're highly motivated, that's fine. But otherwise, just assume that your commitments are generally weak, and immediately, instead of planning too much, immediately start with a small commitment. Go for a 1 kilometer run today. Let's say you want to start a blog. Start by writing one blog post instead of thinking about writing one blog every week and then pushing yourself into saying that, okay, I can't do this. Sometimes getting over your initial resistance is a much bigger challenge than actually doing what you want to do. Once you begin, and as you get comfortable doing it, you can slowly escalate or evolve your goals. Number 2, make your commitments public. All of us deeply care about how we are seen by others. While this is a problem generally, we can also use this for our benefit by making our intentions or commitments public. Now find a small group of people you trust and tell them about your intentions of starting something. Even ask them to inquire about your progress after a week or week after week. If you want to go a step further, declare your intent of, let's say, starting a blog on social media platforms. It will not make you the best blogger in the world, but it will definitely push you to write for a few weeks at least. And once you see the result of this few weeks' work, it will serve as your source of motivation to keep moving forward for another few weeks. Number 3, inspiration is a great trigger, but it is not durable. It doesn't last long. So act on it as soon as you have it. All of us have moments of inspiration when we really want to do something. As Anurag mentioned, the worst thing we can do at this point is to make elaborate plans. Instead, just do something. Start immediately. Want to start a blog? Start writing. Want to go on a 5-kilometer run every day? Go for a 1-kilometer run today. Just act and do something. Angel investor Naval Ravikant puts this final lesson from this episode very beautifully. He says, and I quote, "Inspiration is a perishable commodity. Act before it lapses." I hope you learned a lot from this conversation. If you know someone who would benefit from this conversation, please do share this episode with them. And if you'd like to receive future episodes of The Break School, then do subscribe to The Break School podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, or any of your favorite podcast listening apps. I'll see you again next week with more stories and lessons to help you do what you love. Until then, keep doing what you love every day.